My name is Arthur Cole. I'm 58 years old, and for 35 of those years, I worked at the paper mill over in Covington. It was hard work, loud work, but it was honest. It paid the bills and put my daughter through college. When I retired 3 years ago, I figured I'd spend the rest of my days doing the one thing that always brought me peace: hunting. Not for sport, not for a trophy to hang on the wall, but for the quiet, for the solitude, and to put meat in the freezer for the winter. I've been walking the woods of the George Washington and Jefferson National Forests since I was a boy, taught by my father, who was taught by his. I know the sound of a buck moving through dry leaves versus a doe. I can tell a black bear's track from a hiker's boot print from 50 yards away. I am not a fanciful man. I don't believe in ghosts, I don't read horror novels, and I certainly never gave a moment's thought to campfire stories about monsters in the woods.
The woods were my church, my sanctuary. They were predictable, governed by laws of nature that were as solid and real as the granite cliffs on North Mountain. At least, that's what I used to believe. The place I'm talking about, my spot, is a small, rough-hewn cabin on a ridgeline deep in the national forest, about 20 miles from the nearest paved road. My 3 best friends and I, Cal, Brian, and Jake, bought the land and built the cabin ourselves back in the 80s. It's nothing fancy. 1 room, a pot-bellied stove, 4 bunks, and a small porch that looks out over a valley that turns into a sea of red and gold in the autumn. We called it the Perch. For 3 decades, we'd meet there for the first week of deer season, but I always went up a few days early. I liked to get the cabin aired out, chop a good supply of firewood, and just sit with the silence before the others arrived with their noise and their stories. It was a ritual.
That year, the year everything changed, was no different. I drove my old Ford pickup as far as the logging road would go, then humped my gear the last mile up the trail to the cabin. The air was crisp, smelling of pine and damp earth. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. It was perfect. The first day was exactly as it should have been. I swept out the dust and mouse droppings, stacked wood until my back ached in that satisfying way it does after good work, and sat on the porch as the sun went down, sipping a lukewarm coffee. The forest settled into its evening rhythm. The squirrels chattered their last complaints of the day. A barred owl called out its familiar, "Who cooks for you?" from a distant hemlock, and the breeze whispered through the pines. It was a symphony I knew by heart. I felt the tension from the civilized world, the world of bills and politics, just drain out of me. I was home. I slept soundly that night, the kind of deep, dreamless sleep you only get in true quiet, miles from the nearest engine or siren. The second day started the same. I was up before dawn, checking the sight on my rifle, a Winchester Model 70 in .30-06 that had been my father's. I spent the morning scouting a game trail a half-mile east of the cabin. I saw plenty of sign, deer tracks, scrapes, even a fresh pile of bear scat full of berries. Everything was normal. I felt that familiar hunter's anticipation, that quiet thrill of being part of the landscape, not just an observer. I was back at the cabin by early afternoon, cleaning my rifle and getting a pot of stew simmering on the stove for dinner. It was about 3 o'clock when the first thing happened. The first wrong thing. It was the silence. It wasn't the usual quiet of the deep woods. This was a profound, unnatural stillness. The squirrels stopped chattering. The blue jays, usually the sentinels of the forest, went mute. The insects, the constant low hum of the woods, even they seemed to stop. It was like someone had thrown a thick, soundproof blanket over the entire valley. I've been in the woods when a predator is moving through. Things get quiet, but this was different. This was a dead, oppressive silence. The air itself felt heavy, holding its breath. I stood up from the porch steps, my hand resting on the cabin's railing, and strained my ears. Nothing. Not a leaf rustling, not a bird call. The silence was so complete it was ringing in my ears. I've never felt anything like it. It was a vacuum. I stood there for what felt like 10 minutes, scanning the dense tree line, my senses on high alert. My brain was trying to file it away, to find a logical explanation. A sudden change in barometric pressure, maybe? A hawk circling overhead, scaring everything into hiding? But the silence stretched on, unbroken and deeply unsettling. Then came the sound. It wasn't a snap of a twig or a rustle of leaves. It was a single, immense thump. It came from deep in the woods, down in the hollow to the north. It sounded like a giant dropping a massive log from a great height, a solid, percussive impact that I felt in the soles of my boots. But there was no accompanying crash of branches, no tearing sound of a tree falling through the canopy, just that one solitary, bone-jarring boom. And then the suffocating silence returned. I tried to rationalize it, a deadfall, an old oak, rotten at the core, finally giving way and the trunk hitting the ground just so. It was possible. Or maybe a small rock slide on one of the steeper parts of the ridge. That made sense. I told myself that's what it had to be. But the explanation felt thin, unsatisfying. A falling tree makes a hell of a racket. This was too clean, too singular. I stayed on the porch for another hour, my stew forgotten on the stove, the Winchester now resting across my lap. The woods slowly, tentatively, came back to life. A single chickadee chirped, then another. A squirrel started scolding something from a high branch. The oppressive feeling lifted, but a seed of unease had been planted. For the first time in 30 years, I felt like a guest in that forest, not a resident. That night, I barred the cabin door, something I never did when I was alone. The next day, I forced myself back into my routine, determined to shake off the feeling. I told myself I was just an old man getting jumpy. I hunted the West Ridge, away from where the sound had come from. The day was normal, uneventful. I saw a few does and a young buck, too small to take. I returned to the cabin feeling more like myself, the unease from the day before fading into the background. I convinced myself I had overreacted. I cooked my dinner, read a chapter from an old paperback, and banked the fire in the stove. I was just about to turn in for the night when I heard the scraping sound. It was a dry, rasping noise, coming from the back wall of the cabin, the one that faced the thickest part of the woods. It sounded like a heavy branch being dragged slowly along the log walls. Scrape. Pause. Scrape. My heart hammered against my ribs. I froze, listening. A bear, I thought. A big black bear, rubbing itself against the cabin, trying to scratch an itch. They do that sometimes. I grabbed my flashlight and my rifle, my hands moving slowly, deliberately, trying not to make a sound. The scraping stopped. I held my breath, straining to hear anything over the pounding in my ears. Then came a new sound, right next to the single window on that back wall. It was a wet, snuffling noise, a deep, guttural sniffing. Inhale, exhale. A sound of immense lungs drawing in air, trying to catch a scent. My scent. The window was a good 6 feet off the ground. A bear would have to be standing on its hind legs to get its nose up that high. And this didn't sound like a bear. The breathing was too deep, too rhythmic. It sounded calm, inquisitive. I crept towards the window, my rifle held at the ready. The sniffing stopped. I waited. A minute passed. 2. The silence stretched, thick and menacing. Slowly I lifted my head to peer over the windowsill. There was nothing there. Just the dark woods, bathed in the pale light of a half-moon. I stood there for a long time, watching, but nothing moved. The next morning I went outside as soon as it was light, my rifle in my hands. I circled around to the back of the cabin. My blood ran cold. There were marks on the logs, right below the window. They weren't the short, curved gouges a bear's claws would make. These were long, parallel scratches, almost perfectly vertical, starting well above my head and dragging downwards. There were 4 of them, deep and clean, as if made by something with incredible strength and precision. It looked like someone had taken a garden rake made of steel blades and dragged it down the wall. I reached up and touched the splintered wood. Whatever made those marks had been standing on 2 legs, and it had been tall. The logical part of my brain was screaming, trying to find an answer. A prank? Some kids with a tool? But we were 20 miles from any town. Nobody came up here. The unease from 2 days ago came rushing back, 10 times stronger. It was no longer a vague feeling. It was a cold, hard certainty. Something was out here. Something that shouldn't be. That evening, I didn't even try to pretend things were normal. I ate a cold meal from a can and sat on the porch with the Winchester, my back against the cabin wall, watching the sun go down. I wasn't hunting deer anymore. I was on watch. The woods grew dark, the shadows between the trees deepening from gray to black. My eyes scanned the tree line, moving from one dark shape to another, trying to pick out anything that didn't belong. And then I saw it. For just a second. It was about 100 yards out, near a stand of ancient, moss-covered oaks. A shape detached itself from the deeper shadow of the trees. It didn't step out so much as it just appeared. It was tall, impossibly so, taller than any man I'd ever seen. It was silhouetted against the last dying glow of twilight in the western sky. It was standing on 2 long, powerfully built legs. The legs seemed wrong, bent at an angle that wasn't human. Its shoulders were massive, broad, and hunched. Its arms were long, hanging down almost to its knees. But it was the head that made my breath catch in my throat. It was long-snouted, with pointed ears silhouetted against the sky. It was the head of a wolf, or a huge dog, sitting atop a hulking, man-like body. It turned its head slowly, as if scanning the valley. And for a heartbeat, I felt like it was looking right at me. I raised the rifle, my hands trembling, trying to get the shape in my scope. But as quickly as it had appeared, it took one long, fluid step sideways and melted back into the trees. It was gone. I sat there, frozen, the rifle shaking in my grip. My mind refused to process what my eyes had just seen. It was impossible. A trick of the light. A strangely shaped tree stump. My mind threw up every rationalization it could find, but they all crumbled to dust. I had seen it. I knew what I had seen. The stories, the old whispers you hear from time to time from other hunters, the tales you dismiss as drunken rambling, they all came flooding back. I didn't have a name for it then, but I knew it was real, and it knew I was here. I scrambled back inside the cabin, slammed the heavy oak door, and dropped the bar into place. I dragged the heavy oak table we used for eating and cleaning fish and wedged it against the door. I checked the shutters on the windows, making sure they were latched tight. The cabin, which had always felt so safe and cozy, now felt like a flimsy wooden box in the middle of an ocean.
a very dark, very deep ocean. The night was silent for a long time. I sat on my bunk, the rifle across my knees, a box of shells on the small table beside me. The only sounds were the ticking of my watch and the frantic beating of my own heart. I thought about my friends. Cal, Brian, and Jake were due to arrive in 2 days. I had to warn them. But there was no cell service up here. I was completely cut off. My only choice was to survive the night and hike out at first light. Abandon the camp, the hunt, everything. Just get out. Around midnight, the first howl started. It was not the howl of a wolf. I've heard wolves. Their cries are wild and beautiful. This was something else entirely.
It was a deep, resonant sound that seemed to come from the very bowels of the earth. It started low, a guttural moan, and rose in pitch until it became a piercing, agonizing scream that echoed off the surrounding ridges. There was a terrifying intelligence in it. It wasn't just an animal call, it was a declaration. It was a sound of rage and hunger and ancient hatred. The sound vibrated through the log walls of the cabin, through the floorboards, and up into my bones. Before the echoes of the first howl had even died, it was answered. Another one, from the opposite side of the valley. This one was higher pitched, more frenzied. Then a third joined in, from down in the hollow where I'd heard the tree fall. They were talking to each other. They were coordinating, and they were closing in. A strange impulse took hold of me. It was a mix of sheer terror and a desperate, reporter-like need to have some kind of proof, to validate my own sanity. I had a small, cheap digital audio recorder I used to make notes for myself about deer sightings, weather conditions, that sort of thing. I fumbled in my pack, my hands shaking so badly I could barely work the zipper. I found it, switched it on, and set it on the windowsill, pressing the small red button to record. I had to have something. If I didn't make it out, maybe someone would find it. If I did, maybe someone would believe me. The howls grew closer, louder. They weren't just in the valley anymore. They were on the ridge. They were just outside the tree line. The sound was deafening, a chorus of nightmare voices that scraped at my sanity. Then the howls stopped, and a new sound began. A heavy, rhythmic thud, thud, thud against the front of the cabin. It wasn't a frantic scrabbling, it was deliberate. Something was testing the door, pushing against it with immense weight and strength. The whole cabin shuddered with each impact. The table I'd wedged against the door scraped against the floorboards, pushed back an inch at a time. I scrambled over, adding my own weight, pushing back with all my might. The wood of the door groaned, the hinges straining. Then came a sound from the roof, a heavy scraping, the sound of claws on the metal sheeting, followed by a weight so great the timbers overhead creaked in protest. It was walking on my roof, pacing back and forth, its heavy footfalls shaking dust from the ceiling. It was looking for a way in, testing the chimney, the eaves. This wasn't a dumb animal. This was intelligent. It was tactical. While one was trying to break down the door, another was looking for an alternate point of entry. My fear turned into a kind of cold, focused rage. This was my cabin, my sanctuary, and these things were trying to tear it apart with me inside. A loud crack came from the side of the cabin, followed by the splintering of wood. The window. They were tearing at the heavy wooden shutters. I spun around, raising my rifle. I could see it through the small gaps between the slats. A shape, blacker than the night outside, was pulling at the wood. I saw fingers, long, thick, almost human-like fingers, tipped with claws like black daggers, wrap around the edge of a plank and tear it away with a screech of protesting nails. For a fraction of a second, I saw a patch of coarse, dark fur and a gleam of a single yellow eye. I didn't think. I just acted. I aimed the rifle at the opening where the plank had been and fired. The roar of the .30-06 inside the small cabin was deafening. The recoil slammed the butt of the rifle into my shoulder. The flash from the muzzle lit up the night outside for a split second. A scream answered my shot, a sound of pure agony and fury that was unlike anything I had ever heard. It was not animal. It was not human. It was something in between, a shriek of rage that clawed at my eardrums. The hand vanished. I heard a heavy body crash through the underbrush outside, followed by a series of deep, angry growls. The assault on the cabin intensified. The thing on the roof began jumping up and down, the whole structure threatening to collapse. The one at the door stopped pushing and started ramming, throwing its full weight against the wood. Rocks began to hit the cabin, not pebbles but heavy stones, some as big as my fist, thrown with incredible force. They slammed against the walls and hammered on the metal roof like cannonballs, each impact making me flinch. They were trying to frighten me, to break me, to flush me out. I frantically chambered another round, my ears ringing from the gunshot. My heart was a wild animal trapped in my chest. I felt a primal terror I had never known was possible, but beneath it, a stubborn refusal to die like a cornered rat. The siege lasted for what felt like an eternity. Hours crawled by. I stayed away from the walls, moving to the center of the room, turning in a slow circle, my rifle pointed at every shadow. The things outside were relentless. They circled the cabin, growling, snarling, occasionally letting out one of those soul-shredding howls. I heard their claws scraping on the logs. I heard their heavy, panting breaths just outside the thin wooden walls. They were communicating in a series of low, guttural clicks and grunts. They were hunting me like a pack. Sometime during the night, one of them threw a huge rock that smashed clean through the window pane I had shot near, showering the floor with glass. The wooden shutter was all that kept it out. I fired another shot through the damaged shutter and was answered by another enraged roar. I was down to my last handful of cartridges. I started to lose hope. The cabin felt like it was shrinking, the walls closing in. The relentless noise, the violence, the sheer, malevolent presence of the creatures outside was wearing me down. I was exhausted, my adrenaline giving way to a bone-deep weariness. I found myself thinking that maybe it would be better to just open the door, to face it and get it over with. But then I thought of my wife, my daughter. I thought of my friends who would walk into this nightmare in 2 days. That thought gave me a new surge of resolve. I would not let them find me in pieces in my own cabin. I would fight until my last breath, my last bullet. I don't know when I first noticed the change. It was subtle. The sky outside the broken window was no longer pure black, but a deep, bruised purple. Dawn was coming. The assault began to lessen. The rock throwing stopped. The ramming at the door became less frequent. The guttural growls and clicks grew more distant. I heard one last long howl from the far side of the ridge, a sound of frustration and defeat. And then, silence. Not the oppressive, unnatural silence from before, but the gentle, normal silence of the woods just before sunrise. They were gone. The light had driven them away. They were creatures of the night. I didn't move for a long time. I just stood there in the middle of the room, shaking, listening to the first birds begin to sing. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. I waited until the sun was fully up, its rays streaming through the broken window, before I dared to move. My body ached. My ears were still ringing. I cautiously approached the door, and with trembling hands, removed the table and lifted the bar. I took a deep breath, chambered my last round,
and pulled the door open. The porch was a wreck. It was littered with rocks and splinters of wood from the shutters. The heavy oak railing was broken in one place, snapped like a twig. But it was the ground around the cabin that stopped me cold. The damp earth was churned up, covered in tracks.
They were huge, 5-toed tracks, like those of a massive wolf, but with one horrifying difference. There was a distinct heel print behind the pad, long and almost human. They were the tracks of a creature that walked on 2 legs. They were everywhere, circling the cabin, leading to the door, under the broken window. I felt sick to my stomach. Seeing the evidence in the clear light of day made it all the more terrifyingly real. I didn't waste a second. I ran back inside, grabbed my truck keys, my wallet, and the small digital recorder from the windowsill. I didn't pack anything else. I left my father's rifle, my gear, the simmering pot of stew from 2 days ago. I left it all. I half ran, half stumbled down the trail to where my truck was parked. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves in the breeze sent a jolt of panic through me. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see one of them step out from between the trees. But the woods were empty. I reached the truck, gasping for breath, and fumbled with the keys. I jammed the key in the ignition and turned. The engine coughed and sputtered, but it started. I have never been so happy to hear that old engine roar to life. I threw it in reverse, ready to get the hell out of there, and felt the truck lurch sickeningly to one side. A flat tire. I jumped out, my heart sinking. The rear driver's side tire was completely flat, sitting on the rim. And it wasn't a simple puncture. There was a long, deep gash in the sidewall, a single, clean cut. They had tried to disable my truck. They had known I would try to escape. The cold intelligence of it was almost more frightening than the physical violence. I've never changed a tire so fast in my life. My hands were slick with sweat, and I kept dropping the lug wrench. My head was on a constant swivel, scanning the silent, watching trees that surrounded the clearing. Every muscle in my body was screaming with tension. I finally got the spare on, threw the flat and the jack in the bed of the truck, and jumped back into the cab. I didn't follow the logging road. I drove straight through the underbrush, smashing through saplings and bushes until I hit the main gravel road. I floored it, sending gravel flying, not slowing down until my tires hit the blessed asphalt of the state highway. I didn't look back. I drove straight to the sheriff's office in the next county. I must have looked like a madman. I was covered in dirt and sweat, my clothes were torn, and I hadn't slept in over 30 hours. I stumbled into the station and tried to tell my story to the young deputy at the front desk. I'm sure I sounded incoherent, babbling about monsters and a siege. He listened with a patient, practiced look of professional concern that didn't reach his eyes. He kept nodding and saying, "Okay, sir," and "Take it easy." He clearly thought I was drunk or crazy. I remembered the recorder. "I have proof," I said, my voice cracking. I recorded it. I fumbled it out of my pocket and hit play. The sound filled the quiet office, the low, guttural moans rising into those blood-curdling howls and screams. The deputy's polite mask faltered for a second. His eyes widened. Another, older officer came out of a back room, a coffee mug in his hand. He listened for a moment, his brow furrowed. The recording ended. There was a moment of silence. "Probably a mountain lion," the older officer said, taking a sip of his coffee. "They can make some god-awful sounds. Or maybe a pack of coyotes getting after a buck. Sounds can play tricks on you in the woods at night." They took my statement. I told them everything, about the silence, the tracks, the slashed tire, the damage to the cabin. They wrote it all down. They filed it as vandalism and property damage, possibly by local youths or bear activity. They told me they'd send a car up to take a look when they had a chance, but the road was probably washed out. It was a gentle, bureaucratic dismissal. I was just another old man who got spooked by a shadow and a strange noise in the woods. They suggested I go home and get some rest. I walked out of that station feeling more alone than I had when I was trapped in the cabin. No one was going to help. No one believed me. I called Cal and told him not to go up to the cabin. I didn't tell him why, not then. I just said the road was impassable and I was heading home. A week later, after I'd had time to sleep and try to piece my mind back together, I got a call. It was from a man named George, an old forest ranger who was nearing retirement. I'd known him for years, would see him out on the fire roads sometimes. His voice was low, serious. He said he'd heard about the report I'd filed. He asked me if I was okay. Then he said something I will never forget. "Arthur," he said, "I'm not supposed to be telling you this, but you're a good man, and you know these woods, so I'm telling you. Sell your share of that cabin and never go back to that ridge again. Ever." I asked him why. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Let's just say your report isn't the first of its kind from that area," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Over the years, other things have happened. People go in, they don't come out. We find their camps torn apart. The official story is always a bear attack, or they got lost and succumbed to the elements. But the folks who have to go in and get them, we see things. Things that don't add up." He wouldn't say anything more. He just repeated his warning. "Stay away from there, Arthur, for your own good." It was the only validation I ever got, and it was terrifying. He knew. He didn't know what they were, but he knew they were real. I sold my share of the cabin to Cal for $1. I told him and the others a watered-down version of the story, that a big, aggressive bear had torn up the place and I didn't feel safe there anymore. They thought I'd lost my nerve in my old age. Brian even made a joke about it. We drifted apart after that. How could I explain it to them? How could I make them understand the soul-deep terror of that night? The friendship we'd had for 40 years just couldn't survive what I had been through. The shared experience was gone. I was on one side of a door, and they were on the other, and I could never go back through it. That was 3 years ago. I haven't set foot in a forest since. I sold my rifles, all of them. The thought of walking under a canopy of trees, of being in the quiet woods, fills me with a cold dread I can't shake. The place that was my sanctuary is now the source of my deepest fears. My wife says I'm a different man. I don't sleep well. Any strange noise at night has me bolt upright in bed, my heart pounding. I have nightmares filled with yellow eyes and long, clawed fingers. The sound of a dog barking too aggressively can send a shiver down my spine. The world feels thinner now, more fragile. I know that the neat, orderly world we live in is a fiction. It's a well-lit room, and just outside the door, in the darkness, things are waiting. Ancient things. Sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet, I take out that little digital recorder. I put on headphones so my wife won't hear, and I press play. I listen to the sounds of that night. I do it to remind myself that I'm not crazy, that it was real. Every time I hear those howls, that intelligent, malevolent rage, I am transported back to that cabin. I can smell the gunpowder and the fear. I can feel the walls shaking. It's a kind of self-torture, I suppose. But it's also my anchor to reality. It's my proof. I don't know what those things were. The old ranger's warning. The folklore you can find if you look for it. It gives them a name, but a name doesn't explain them. They are a tear in the fabric of what is supposed to be real.
All I know is that they are intelligent, they are strong, and they hate us. They are out there, in the deep, dark places of the world, in the parts of the map that are still blank. I'm telling this story because people need to know. Not everyone who goes into the woods comes out. Not every strange sound is a coyote. Trust your instincts. If a place feels wrong, if the woods go silent, leave. Don't try to be brave. Don't try to be rational. Just turn around and walk away. Because some things aren't meant to be understood. They are only meant to be survived. And I know, with a certainty that has settled deep in my bones, they're still out there on that ridge, hunting and waiting.